So welcome, everybody. We're so excited to have you all join us this evening for our presentation tonight on climate change and land use planning and how they intersect. So normally this would have been our evening for what we refer to as our Southeast Regional Conservation Commission gathering, where we meet twice a month or twice a year and have a presentation and then have a time for our conservation commissions to share information with one another. This topic came up as one of interest, and I heard immediately from many people, we'd love to have some of our other town representatives involved. So I think tonight we have representatives not only from conservation commissions, but planning commissions. I see some energy committees here. So we're excited to have representatives from across different committees from town governments around the region. So for that reason, it's sort of a modified version of our gathering. We won't necessarily be doing the sharing of our Conservation Commission activities at the end of this evening. And we're going to focus more instead and give a lot of time for our presentation and discussion around climate change and land use planning. So I'm excited tonight to be able to welcome two speakers who are from the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. We have Ann Janda, who is the Energy Project Manager, and we have Taylor Newton, who is the Planning Program Coordinator. So we're super excited, and Ann and Taylor, we're going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Margot. Thank you for inviting us. We really appreciate the invitation. Also, just want you to know that we're not super familiar with Southern Vermont and your needs. So just, realize that we created this information sort of Chittenden County specific, but we do think that it will apply in a lot of different cases. So I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation.
While you do that, and I will caveat that I've worked in a non-Chittenden County or for non-Chittenden County RPC before. I worked at Northwest Regional Planning Commission, serving Franklin County and Grand Isle County. So while we may not be know the specifics of what's going down in Windham County, I do have experience working with rural RPCs, specifically on land use planning. So I'll try to bring that to the table tonight.
Thank you, Taylor. How does that look? Are you seeing it at full screen?
We are now.
Okay, so when I first started as the Energy Project Manager at Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission a little over a year ago, the number one request that energy committees had for me was, could I give them something they could share with their planning commissions on land use planning and climate change. And we didn't have anything at the time, but we kind of had all the information. So got together with staff and put together a piece that gives the information on this topic. So I'm going to go over that with you now. So we're going to talk about sources of greenhouse gas emissions, the importance of planning and land use regulations in addressing greenhouse gas emissions, and tools for planning compact walkable neighborhoods in town centers. So as I'm sure you're all aware, we are experiencing climate change in Vermont now. This is the first winter since I've lived in Vermont where it rained for several weeks in January, first time ever. So things are changing. Spring arrives earlier, later, and it's affecting everything in our lives. And climate change is being caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Here is a chart that shows you the greenhouse gas emissions levels in Vermont 40% of our emissions come from transportation. 34% come from thermal, which means heating our homes with fossil fuel sources. However, our electric grid is now much lower in terms of emissions. In 2017, there were new regulations that incentivize the utilities to have an energy mix that comes from more carbon-free sources. So Green Mountain Power is saying that their portfolio is 100% carbon-free. And my understanding is that the other energy utilities in Vermont are very good, you know, maybe between 90 and 100% carbon-free at this point. So what that means is that, you know, electrifying transportation and heating of our homes will greatly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are a few other sources of emissions, including agriculture, industrial processes, and waste. And this piece of information came from the Energy Action Network website. They have quite a bit of information if you want to get up to speed on the technicalities of greenhouse gas emissions and the solutions. So I also pulled up this data from the Energy Action Network report. It's important to realize that 71% of the vehicle greenhouse gas emissions comes from passenger cars. A much smaller percent comes from heavy duty vehicles. And, you know, the thought is that, you know, aviation and jet fuel is causing, you know, a good portion of our emissions in Vermont. And it's really just cars. And we're more rural and we drive a lot. So we're going to dig into that a little bit deeper here with our recommendations. So the importance of land use planning to address greenhouse gas emissions. So I want to talk about the difference between low density sprawl and high density or compact walkable neighborhoods. So low density development, you know, especially in rural areas like ours, causes the need for more energy for heating and cooling because there are larger building footprints with higher heating and cooling needs. But even more than that, the sprawling suburban and rural areas cause us to be heavily dependent on our cars. We're not near public transportation. We you know, need to go long distances just to go to the grocery store or whatnot, or to get to our jobs. A lot of us commute a long distance to get to our jobs. So the way that we have developed has really contributed to this car-centric culture that we have. So what we would like to propose is that your land use regulations can be used to increase density in the areas that are already planned for growth and are near the things that you need to get to. This would allow for less driving, more walking, more biking, more use of public transit, in addition to electrifying processes. So thinking about land use patterns is important. We're talking about, you know, planning for more density in village areas and town centers, which would enable preservation of the rural, less developed areas outside of the centers. So this also protects forests and wildlife habitat, river corridors, wetlands, and riparian areas. And I just want to point your attention to building envelopes as well is important to think about in land use regulations. The picture on the left is showing a really long driveway with a really large building envelope, which clears a lot of forest land. And on the right is what we would propose, is going to be better in terms of protecting wildlife habitat and protecting forest areas for carbon sequestration. So the effects of low density development or sprawl in suburban areas, it's caused by not having careful plans, and leads to fragmented forests, loss of rural areas, encourages more driving, larger homes, more stormwater runoff, and ultimately more greenhouse gas emissions. All right, so any questions so far? I'm going to go back before I hand it over to Taylor. Barry, go ahead.
I had a question, actually a couple questions. One is, I know we've been at this for a long time, and one big key thing is transportation. We have no public transportation, and at the cost of electric vehicles and installing what you need to install for an electric vehicle, that's out of the realm of a lot of people in terms of their finances. We also are undergoing our planning, our zoning bylaw, and we had proposed a very large conservation district, going with 30-acre minimum lot sizes. And we've gotten a great deal of pushback from people who are actually in the current use program and people who have put a lot of their property into the land trust and that sort of thing. So we did reduce our lot sizes in our villages to increase the density in the villages and hopefully create more open space. But we go from quarter-acre lots or half-acre lots, quarter-acre lots deep in the village, and then we go to half-acre lots, and then we go to 30. Well, the proposal was 30 acres. We're still in the process of getting this passed, but and there's nothing in between. And we've heard from property owners all over the place about this. So it's very difficult. The larger lots also are out of reach of a lot of people in terms of purchasing those. So that, and then water and wastewater is a big problem. We're undergoing a water and wastewater. We've got actually a lot to do. We got some funds from ARPA to do some water and wastewater in our town, but we've gotten pushback on that. So there's a lot of local issues in terms of getting a lot of these things done, and I'm not sure what the solution is, but it's very interesting trying to get some of these things forwarded.
Yeah, that does sound like a confluence of things. Margot, you don't have any public transportation in your area? Are there any plans?
It depends on the communities, in some of the transportation corridors. So there is some public transportation along the Connecticut River corridor from Bellows Falls down to Brattleboro, and then along the Route 30 corridor, but it's not frequent enough that people can regularly count on it to commute to work. So I would say most of our communities do not have public transportation.
Okay, good to know. Barry, did you have a question?
Hi, thank you. That first slide you had that had, I think, 71% of transportation. And then there was a low, maybe 2% for energy. And you were suggesting that if we were able to lower the transportation or raise the energy, I'm not quite sure how you were talking about using more electricity. You were talking about using more electricity. And I, of course, go to electric vehicles. I have an electric vehicle. I love my electric vehicle. And it makes me feel good when I look at this and I see that, well, I'm not contributing to part of this 40%. Yet, if we're going to have more chargers in the state, which we desperately need, will the existing electrical generation potentials that are carbon free be able to offset a percentage of this 40% energy going to transportation? And has that been considered? Because I didn't hear you talk about electric vehicles at all as you were talking about.
Annual,
Yep. So we're not going to get too deep into that in this presentation, but yes, electrifying the transportation is considered a high impact action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as far as, I think your question is, will Vermont's electric grid be able to handle the increased electric consumption from all the electric vehicles? And the studies that I've seen show that, it's ramping up slowly enough. The EV ownership and the switch to heat pumps in homes, that the electrical grid is going to be able to keep pace with the demand. Did you have anything to say about that, Taylor?
yeah, I just wanted to add that I am not going to be able to quote numbers off the top of my head, Barry, but the electric distribution utilities in the state are subject to the rules in the Vermont Renewable Energy Standard. And the Vermont Renewable Energy Standard talks about how much electricity those utilities have to provide that comes from renewable sources. And so, as electricity demand likely grows in the future, the utilities are going to have to figure out how do they maintain compliance with the Renewable Energy Standard and seek out additional renewable sources to supply the needed electricity. Does that answer your question?
That definitely answers part of the question. I guess what the other part of the question is like, I'm not hearing in this conversation how much it is that you're looking at switching. What numbers, what are being considered? What are the plans?
I would refer you to your regional enhanced energy plan, which will provide targets specifically to Windham County in terms of, how many new EVs we should target having within Windham County in, I think, 2030, 2025, 2030, 2040, 2050. Margot, am I getting that right?
That sounds right, Taylor.
Okay, thank you.
And the regional planning commissions, when they adopted enhanced energy plans a few years ago, were required to disaggregate those targets onto the municipal level. And so your municipality a few years ago probably got a disaggregated target from the region that you guys could include in your own municipal plan if you chose so.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's a high number, and right now there's not enough EVs available for us to sort of move the dial on that. We need to get more EVs into the market, and it's been kind of slow lately. But moving on, Far, did you have a question?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, thanks. Well, not so much a question, but just on the subject of the electricity being 2% of our emissions. I guess I take some issue with Green Mountain Power's claim that they are 100% no carbon emissions, because they're that for one thing, 40% of their energy mix comes from Hydro-Quebec. And that does not account for any of the carbon emissions, methane emissions specifically from inundation of previously forested lands. So they're kind of fudging with the numbers a little bit, and they're also buying a lot of renewable energy credits from elsewhere to make that claim. So it's not like our energy mixture is zero carbon. It's just that we've fudged some numbers a little bit here and there. And I just don't want us to go down the path of thinking that we just can electrify everything and the problem will be solved. I don't know how much that really applies to the land use planning stuff that we're talking about here, but I just kind of like put that out there as a little bit of a cautionary figure.
Those are good points for sure. Yeah. Tatiana.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make a comment about, and I'm sure we can discuss this more later, but just in the general points that you made, Anne, about, obviously favoring more dense development in the village, in the already developed villages as opposed to elsewhere. That makes a lot of sense to me. But on the other hand, in Vermont, it seems like a lot of the villages are clustered around in these river corridors, in these low-lying river areas where they shouldn't really be. They're already, I live in Westminster West, which is a little village, and it's all these houses were built in a wetland, on top of water where they probably should never have been. And so it seems like, encouraging more development here would be kind of crazy. So, in terms of impact on the wetlands and the wastewater infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. So it's a complicated, it just seems like the sort of simple, let's have more dense development in the villages is very complex in Vermont.
I think that's raises an important point in terms of our historical development pattern in the state, Tatiana. I think municipalities can deal with that in a couple different ways. You can double down and still allow development in your floodplains and river corridors if you want. Requiring 2, 3, 4 feet of freeboard, between the top of that floodplain and where that front door of that new development is. A place like Montpelier has to do that. Really, they're stuck. The other side of the spectrum is kind of the more crazy idea of, municipalities can really proactively plan for other areas where it may be more appropriate to have defense development that, right now is rural. And those are going to be hard community conversations to have, kind of creating those new town centers, but that's something that should be thought about.
Right.
So I know that we still have a few questions out there, but I would like, we will have time for discussions and further questions coming up. And I'd like to give this opportunity for our presenters to get back to their presentation because this may answer a few of our questions. So hold on to those questions or put them in the chat and we'll have an opportunity to get to those.
Yeah, thank you, Margot. I just put a link in the chat, and this is to the Enabling Better Places guide. This is a zoning guide for Vermont neighborhoods. It's all about different incremental changes we can make to our local zoning that will hopefully not ruffle too many feathers, but get us to a place where our zoning allows for the type of density our historical villages were built as. So feel free to take a look at that. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight are suggestions from that guide. And so how do we actually regulate to create compact walkable places? Anna went over why we need to do this. State statute has included the goal of compact village centers surrounded by rural countryside, but how do we get there? And so I've got a couple specific suggestions to get us there. In terms of encouraging density in areas planned for growth, no minimum lot sizes, I think is one approach that the municipality can take. I know that sounds really extreme, but a lot of our historical villages, were built on 1/8 acre, 1/7 acre, not very large lots. And I think Vermont has a propensity to perhaps have really large minimum lot sizes, an acre or more. And that's really rooted in a time when municipalities used to regulate wastewater, pre-2007, and really kind of took suburban zoning and strapped it on to municipalities and applied it everywhere. But now we've got more innovative ways to treat wastewater, even on an individual system basis. And the state regulates it. So it's out of the municipality's control. So if you guys really want to have smaller lots, go for it. Even if you don't have a municipal wastewater system. Removing maximum residential density is another thing to think about, or detaching the regulation of density from lot size. A lot of municipalities, most of rural Vermont, the zoning regs will say, 1 unit per acre. 1 acre is the minimum lot size. You can detach those things. You can have a minimum lot size rule, and you can have a separate density rule. They don't have to match up totally. You could have a 1 acre minimum lot size, but allow 4 units per acre. You can make the math work that way, and that's going to enable probably more diverse housing types, for instance. You're probably more likely to get, maybe a fourplex than a single family home in that kind of situation. And in circumstances where you have wastewater in particular, you can regulate density in other ways besides having a density calculation. You can regulate density through height standards, through building footprint standards, through coverage standards, lot coverage standards. You're not going to know the exact number of units that might get built in that location, but you're going to have a really good idea about what the built form looks like when a building is built on a lot, and that is going to create a top end in terms of how many units are going to go on that lot. Lowering or removing minimum parking standards. This is not new. I'm sure you guys have heard this before. It's really hard in our auto-centric world to do this. I was working with Williston recently on a project in Taft Corners, trying to promote more housing there. And they really had a hard time requiring less than, 1 parking space per dwelling unit, or 1.25. But the reality is, for a long time, we've been over-regulating parking and requiring too much, and that adds a lot to the cost of development, and it also takes up a lot of space. So if we can get to a place where we remove that municipal standard, and not to sound too much like a capitalist, but to have the market kind of dictate how much parking is needed, and let the property owner kind of figure out what they need in order to serve their tenants. I think that's a better way to go. And it gets the municipality out of the business of regulating parking. The last one is the big one. I've already seen people in the chat talk about this or ask questions kind of around this, but planning for infrastructure, planning for water and wastewater is really the thing you should be doing. And particularly wastewater right now in municipalities that have unsewered villages, there's a really good deal in terms of 100% loan forgiveness for planning studies to figure out preliminary engineering and even final design for municipal wastewater systems. We're not going to get density or real density, more than maybe a 1 unit every quarter acre on average in a village without having a municipal wastewater system. Moving on, adopt an official map. And by official map, I mean something very specific. An official map is a tool that's talked about in Title 24 in state statute. And it's about the municipality proactively planning for future needs, future land needs, specifically for future public facilities. And that could be roads, that could be stormwater treatment, that could be wastewater treatment, that could be parks. The statute's really broad. And so the municipality on a map can say, we need that land in the future for X public facility. And then there's a whole thing in statute that talks about if that developer goes to apply to develop that land, they shall essentially accommodate that planned public infrastructure. And if they don't, there's a process the developer can go through if the town doesn't want to buy that land from that developer. Long and the short of it is this is a way to proactively inform property owners what public needs are in the future. It's a proactive way for municipalities to budget to buy land to accommodate future public needs. for public facilities. And it's a way to, frankly, just lay out a future road network, grid network in your village or next to your existing village to make sure that you do have compact blocks and a compact village. Allowing more than one structure on a lot, I think, is a really simple one. A lot of rural municipalities only allow one structure per lot. And if you do more than one structure on a lot, you typically got to do a PUD, which is a 3-step process in most municipalities that can take 6 months to over a year. And it's kind of silly when we're talking about a village area where there often historically have been more than one structure per lot. You can still have the application go to DRB. You just put it through site plan review, 1 hearing instead of 3. But just allow more than one structure per lot. You still have the parking standards, you still have other dimensional standards, but you can make that simple change. A lot of municipalities have really strict rules about how non-conforming structures in villages can be changed. There are a lot of villages that, let's say, have a 35-foot setback, very suburban front setback, when historically buildings have been built, somewhere between 5 and 10 feet away from the edge of the public right of way. And if you have really strict non-conforming structure rules, that building may not be able to be added onto or changed within that setback area. And so you can be a little bit more permissive about how those buildings can change and evolve over time in your local zoning rules. And let's move on. Use regulations is another really simple way that municipalities can change their regulations to reduce the regulatory burden on property owners. And so by simplifying these regulations, you can really keep it, and honestly, in really small towns, really basic. Single household dwelling, 2 household dwelling, multifamily, commercial, industrial. It doesn't need to be more complex than that. Just have broad definitions. It also allows for innovative future uses potentially that may not be possible in a place that really strictly defines use types. The other thing I think to really think about is that a lot of municipalities really lean heavily on conditional use for like everything besides a single family home. You don't need to do that in a village. If we think again historically in our villages, there's always been a really diverse types of uses there. Again, duplexes, multifamily, all types of commercial uses. Those should be permitted and not conditional. For those non-single family homes and duplexes, you can still have them go to the DRB through a site plan review if you want to hold that control of putting folks through the DRB. But really the point of conditional use is to ensure that a use fits within the context of the surrounding neighborhood. And my argument is that residential uses always fit within the context of a village, regardless of scale, and so do most commercial uses. So I'd stop leaning on conditional use so much. And can move on to the next slide. This is just a kind of a photo showing a visualization that came out of a project I worked on in Williston recently. And so in Williston, we removed density standards totally. There is no maximum density standard in a place where they're planning for a downtown, not the whole municipality, just in a very specific geographic location. And instead, we've decided to regulate density through height, through building coverage, through building placement on the lot. And what you see on the bottoms, what you see on top is what this space looks like now. What you see on the bottom is what they envision as their future Main Street. And all these buildings you see here fit within their new regulations that lean much more on regulating built form, what the building looks like, and building placement than a standard like density, which is very kind of hard to understand sometimes. It doesn't always result in what you want in your community necessarily from a visual perspective. And we can move on. We've got this slide here to talk about the difference between land use regulations or zoning and building code, because we received a lot of questions in our region about, hey, can we or should we adopt energy code within our zoning code? And our general response is you can adopt stretch code. Statute allows you to do that, but no, it's not a great idea. And from our perspective, adopting an energy code makes a lot more sense as a part of a building code. And I know down in Windham County, Brattleboro might have a building code and probably no one else does, but really zoning code is really supposed to be about the placement of structures on a lot and the uses within those structures. When we get into energy code, we start talking about how a building is constructed. And that is also what building codes do. And so from our perspective, it makes a lot more sense for energy code to be a part of a building code. It hasn't been done in Vermont, but municipalities can band together and adopt a code together and have a permitting official that's shared between municipalities to adopt and enforce a building code. And so folks are really want to get on the thermal issue of the heating issue in terms of energy transportation. There is a state energy code, but there is no enforcement. And so we've got some municipalities that want to do enforcement and they want to make sure people are actually building to code because compliance with RBs is estimated around 50%. And so if you're interested in that, I'd go building code route. We also got a lot of questions on, can you regulate energy related things in your zoning code? And there's a lot of maybes. We've got a lot of questions about, hey, can we require developers to put solar on their buildings, solar panels? The reality is you really can't. The regulation of, let's say net metering systems is under the Public Utility Commission. They have sole jurisdiction over that issue. Municipalities cannot require a property owner to put solar panels in their building. But what you can do, and what a municipality like Williston's thinking of, is maybe we can require buildings to be solar ready, or specifically parking lots be solar ready, and that we require that they put in racking systems on top of their parking lots, especially large ones, to accommodate solar in the future. That's something you can do in your municipal zoning regulations. Lighting standards in zoning regulations, you can regulate what kind of lighting is used. So you can require LEDs if you want. A lot of municipalities are wrestling with how to regulate EV charging, or whether or not they should require EV charging in certain circumstances. And so you can, our suggestion would be to require EV charging for certain sizes of multifamily housing. I'd say probably, 6plex and bigger, maybe. Actually, 50 already does this. So for really large multifamily, they're going to have to do EV charging. But for those smaller sub-jurisdictional multifamilies, it may make sense for a municipality to require EV charging. I wouldn't require a zoning permit for EV charging. It's something we want to encourage. So I'd probably have EV charging under your exemption section of your zoning bylaw. But in terms of specific uses, you could require for multifamily or for any other use for that matter. I think that about does it for this slide, Ann. Contact your RPC if you have questions about land use and zoning. So that's Margot. But that's part of our job here at the RPCs is to help municipalities with those things. Here's the map of the RPCs in the state. I think we've got time for questions.
I'm going to jump in here quickly, Taylor. So one of the challenges in our region and many regions in the state is that some of our communities do have zoning bylaws, but many of them do not. I don't know if you'd be prepared to talk about some suggestions or have some quick suggestions for communities that don't have zoning bylaws, or maybe that's a topic for a whole nother presentation that we should do coming up.
Yeah, a little bit. I work in a region that had municipalities without zoning bylaws. And the power of the ordinance is strong. Select boards can adopt ordinances that regulate a whole bunch of things. And don't quote me, but I believe municipalities can adopt an official map even by ordinance, not by a zoning bylaw. And so you can do planning that way too. You could adopt ordinances to regulate EV charging. You could adopt ordinances about lighting. You can adopt ordinances about a whole slew of things. So advise those municipalities to check out that section in Title 24 that talks about what municipalities can regulate via ordinances.
So I just put our document, climate change and land use in the chat. And that covers what we just went over and more, so that you can have that. Are there any questions for us at this point?
I know we had a couple questions before Taylor had a chance to speak. I'm not remembering whose question that was, but feel free to jump in if you do have a question.
Sound of my voice, just put everyone to sleep talking about zoning.
Zoning does that to me too.
Zoning does that to most people.
But it is a really important way to sort of help, that's the intersection often between climate change, or planning for climate change and the land use. They're very integral. And, I think I just wanted to mention that this type of topic is a great conversation to be having with and between some of your town committees, like say the Conservation Commission or the Energy Committee and the Planning Commission, because sometimes our committees and commissions work in silos, but there's really is this intersection between the two, and it can lead to very productive and good conversations and ways that the two can work together. And I think there was a comment here, please put the document in again. I'm assuming that maybe it's the link. I'm not sure.
There was something, I got myself off, I hit the off button. And right before I did that, I heard, I will add the link to X to this.
Oh,
And-
yes.
And then
Lynn,
it went blank. Thank you.
so it's the, Lynn, it's in the chat. So if you can
Yes.
open up your chat, you'll see the link that Ann put there.
Right.
And I'll just put I'll put a
I'll
plug into
just
this
say that-
document.
Okay.
It may
It's a-
be Pat got erased when she turned it off, so.
Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you. I've got these.
So Guy, I think you had your hand raised.
I think, speaking from the Rockingham Planning Commission and the Energy Committee, one of the things that we're experiencing in Bellows Falls, and for many even know that Bellows Falls is actually the village within Rockingham. Our biggest challenge is we need to look at what are the housing needs and demands are. And at this point, we're seeing from a national and even from a Windham County data that studios, 1 bedroom, maybe 2 bedrooms is what's being asked. And so right now for us, it's a matter of how do we redesign a lot of these old buildings in Bellows Falls in a way to accommodate those housing needs. And at the same time, doing it in a way that the contractor makes money. So it's more a matter of not land use, but realizing these are the issues that we're facing with the Planning Commission and trying to reposition the retrofitting of some of these large homes with 3-4 bedrooms. And so that's where we are with our town plan. So
I'm
it's
gonna
more a
jump
comment.
in for a second here because I just want to point out that one of the things that was mentioned was getting rid of the parking requirements. I know
Yeah.
that many years ago, this was getting to be quite a while ago, here in the village of Saxons River, same town. The prior
Yeah.
owner to a house was trying to add a third unit. There's currently 2 units and trying to add a third unit, but the parking killed the proposal because there was not technically enough parking space to accommodate another unit. So
Yeah.
that's, I think, a key thing to look at and make sure that in Bellows Falls that, you know, you're looking and making sure that maybe it's time to do away with the parking part.
Yeah, we've been having discussions around that too, Margot. So, but I'm not sure where that has landed, but I'm glad you brought it up.
The other thing, you
this
know,
is-
in a more developed place like Bellows Falls, you know, an urban place, you know, is to have the municipality to think about municipal parking that can be used by everyone. And proactively planning for that, and taking the burden off of property owners to have them having a large minimum parking standard. The other thing I would suggest, you know, it looks like you guys have a designated downtown, so just connect with your property owners about that designation program. And you know, tax credits are really how property owners are going to flip those buildings into the kind of housing units that you need.
This is Lynn again with, I believe that there was a program to help multi-unit building owners upgrade their facilities. But the last I read was it was only if it was gutted. So if you have a facility and you've got 2 or 3 bedrooms that or parts of your building that you're dividing up into apartments, to take it down to the studs is really ineffective when you already have a building that works fine. So it was a great idea for a grant, but really not feasible for your average person.
Okay, looks like we have a couple other questions. Stephen?
Yeah, thank you. Taylor, I'm a little unclear about the way you discuss zoning regulations, allowing developers to do certain things. And my impression is, and the question is, are you viewing regulations as something that need to be eased to allow developers more flexibility? Because I could see revising regulations to guide how developers do it. But if you're easing them back and letting developers have a lot of discretion, I think you're asking for a little bit of chaos that will not be too welcome in trying to develop closer housing units. But it's unclear to me what position you're taking. Could you clarify it, please?
Yes. And so I'm gonna talk about context. You know, in rural Vermont, in our areas that are not planned for growth outside of our villages and downtowns, you know, I kind of advocate for the Londonderry approach, large minimum lot sizes, really restricting development in those areas. Within village centers and downtowns, I have a more nuanced recommendation, Stephen. I'd say, allowing more flexibility with some standards that have traditionally been impediments to development. I think the parking example in Bellows Falls is one of them. That's a type of standard that gets in the way of much needed housing development in a place that's planned for growth. But you don't want to give up too much discretion. And so if I'm writing my own zoning bylaw from scratch in a downtown area, I'm probably looking in a form-based code. I'm probably going to regulate what the building looks like, regulate the materials, regulate the placement of that building so matches what we specifically want in our municipality, and being highly regulatory in that way, but being much less regulatory in terms of the use of the building, allowing the market to dictate the use, and much less restrictive, and probably in terms of parking as well. I would also be much more regulatory in terms of the streetscape and what the street needs to look like in terms of on-street parking, in terms of street furniture, in terms of sidewalk, and those sort of public amenities that everyone enjoys. Does that help clarify that a bit?
It clarifies it a bit. Doesn't make me comfortable, but it clarifies it a bit, because one of the things that I'm unclear about in your proposals is zoning regulations were developed to accomplish some things, right or wrong, but they were designed to develop something. And it sounds like, because what the results are, in many respects, you're leaning toward throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I wouldn't throw out regulations. I think I'm a biased person. I think regulations are needed, but I think you may have to modify your regulations. But I wouldn't give too much flexibility to developers, because otherwise you'll lose control of when is someone going to open up an all-night cafe with rock music in the heart of your village. So I think use and there needs to be control. It's not a rapid process, but there needs to be regulation, and there needs to be zoning. There need to be permits. And my concern is not even a concern. The feel of it is you're going a little too far in giving developers a little too much flexibility. But thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the comment. I think it's for every municipality to kind of decide what that balance is that works for them. I understand your point about noise. Again, that's another ordinance thing you can do via ordinance, not via zoning. Definitely not right. Advocating for not permitting things and not permitting development. I still think zoning permits shall be used. But I hear you, and I think every municipality's got to find that balance that works for them.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's see, Michelle, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, hi. I'm Michelle Carlson. I'm with the Planning Commission in Wilmington, Vermont, and we just last week were discussing many of the items on this from your presentation. And my question is if maybe you could help direct me to understand, the higher density village centers. And in the context of Wilmington, I'm concerned with stormwater management and environmental impacts. And I was wondering if you could speak to that. I am an ecological landscape designer and planner, so I always kind of go there. I'm like, I try to not have a knee-jerk reaction and really try to see the whole system 10, 20 years down the road, because climate change really is, we don't know we can see trends, but we don't know exactly what's going to happen. So I wonder if you could direct me to information so I could share that with my community.
Good question. Really good question. I don't know if I can direct you to resources to directly address that, but I can talk about it.
Okay.
I think stormwater in a town like Wilmington, especially, is a paramount concern. I think one thing you always have to remember is obviously the state stormwater permitting system that exists. 0.5 acres or more of impervious, a new impervious, you're gonna have to get a state stormwater permit. So you've always got that to fall back on, or just to know in terms of matching your local regulations, that state regulation. Municipalities can also regulate stormwater on their own through their zoning bylaw. And so if you're planning for a more urban context, you can match that with local stormwater standards that enable that context. Might be expensive, but it could be the easy ones, the rain gardens, the disconnects, the rain barrels. But then you could also start talking about underground storage, and those bigger, more costly things.
Yes, here,
And-
because it's in the context of, I think someone else mentioned, many of these towns are on waterways. On water quality, it's like we love the clean water in Vermont where it exists and keeping that. So what you're saying is this, that the town can do a stormwater bylaw.
You can
And
regulate
when you say it's
stormwater management.
expensive, yeah, when you say costly, well, I do rain gardens and stuff, so I know how much, but it's like in these centers, it's difficult to convey the water where it needs to be. So underground storage would probably be best.
And
Anyway.
maybe, and the other
Thank
thing,
you.
Michelle, I just want to mention, this is something that Williston, had talked a lot about with their consultant to develop their form-based code was, there has been no comprehensive study about how to treat stormwater in urban locations within a municipality. We proactively plan for wastewater, we proactively plan for water in a lot of municipalities. We don't really comprehensively plan for treating stormwater, especially in an urban context where we might combine private and public stormwater. And so that's something that I'm going to probably working with Williston on over the next decade. But I hate to say the U word, but utility. Having a stormwater utility might be something that those places with villages and downtowns they want to think about.
Yeah, I think it's so important for the success of these walkable downtown areas.
Agreed.
Thank you so much.
Michelle, I just want to jump in terms of Wilmington. I don't know if you're aware that Wilmington is currently undergoing a stormwater master plan, and they are working with a company to, the state is paying this company to work with the town to look at existing stormwater issues and make recommendations on projects that would help improve the stormwater in Wilmington. It doesn't help your future needs, but it does identify current issues and makes recommendations on projects that would improve those issues.
I didn't know though. This is where things are in silos.
Yes, it definitely is. So you might want to check in with the town offices, and you can find out a little bit more about where they are at with the stormwater master planning process.
That's really helpful. Thank you, because that's a baseline to go start the conversation. Thank you.
So do we have other questions or comments that people would like to make with our presenters while they're still with us? Okay, well, hearing no current questions, I do encourage everyone to look at that link that Anne put to the climate change and land use brochure that Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission put together. It does cover a lot of the information that they both Anne and Taylor presented tonight, and it's very well put together. And it's something that you could then share within either, your other planning commission members or conservation commission members or your town select board, depending on how the operations in your town look. And then there's a few other resources that there's some other resources there also in the chat. And I just see that will I be sending out info as to where this recording will be available? So I don't have everybody, since this was not a pre-registration, I will probably be doing I have to do a mass sort of email out to planning commissions, conservation commissions, and energy committees with the information. I'll make sure to include the brochure and a link to the recording of this once it is processed.
And just so everyone knows, my contact information is at the bottom of our document. climate change and land use. So if you do have further questions, want to get a hold of me or Taylor, go ahead and email me and we will try to help out.
Great questions, folks. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing this, Margot. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you, Ann and Taylor, and thank you all for coming this evening. We look forward to having future discussions with you.
Bye.